The rain hammered against the chapel windows as I walked down the aisle, my white dress trailing behind me like a ghost. Everyone said I looked radiant, but looking back now, I wonder if what they mistook for joy was actually fear. Deep down, something had always felt wrong about Marcus's family. The way conversations stopped when I entered rooms. The hushed phone calls at 3 in the morning. The expensive gifts that came with no explanation of their origin. But love makes us blind, doesn't it? And I was so desperately in love with Marcus Castellano that I ignored every red flag waving frantically in my peripheral vision. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I discovered that fairy tale weddings sometimes lead to nightmares you never wake up from. It started innocently enough, the way most horror stories do. I was a kindergarten teacher in suburban Chicago, living a quiet, predictable life. My biggest worry was whether little Tommy would stop eating glue before parent conferences. Then I met Marcus at a coffee shop downtown, and suddenly my world exploded into color. He was everything I thought I wanted: charming, generous, attentive. He drove a car that cost more than I made in 2 years, but when I asked about his work, he'd just smile and say he was in family business. The Castellano family owned restaurants throughout the city, or so Marcus told me. That explained the expensive suits, the late-night meetings, the way people seemed to both respect and fear his last name. I should have dug deeper, asked harder questions, but Marcus had this way of deflecting with kisses and weekend trips to places I'd only dreamed of visiting. When you're drowning in attention from someone who seems too good to be true, you don't typically investigate why they're throwing you the life preserver. Our engagement was a whirlwind of expensive venues and guest lists that read like a who's who of people I'd never heard of but who apparently controlled half the city. Marcus's father, Vincent Castellano, was an imposing man with silver hair and eyes like winter storms. He welcomed me into the family with bear hugs and promises that I'd never want for anything, but there was something in his smile that made my skin crawl. His wife, Maria, was elegant and cold, speaking to me in clipped sentences that somehow managed to sound both welcoming and threatening. Marcus's younger brother Tony had dead eyes and a handshake like a vice, while his sister Isabella possessed a beauty that was almost predatory in its perfection. The wedding reception was held at the Castellano family estate, a sprawling mansion that looked more like a fortress than a home. The guests were an eclectic mix of people who seemed to fall into 2 categories: those who looked like they belonged at society galas, and those who looked like they could kill you with their bare hands. The champagne flowed freely, the band played beautifully, and everyone toasted to our happiness. But I noticed things that night that should have sent me running. The way certain guests spoke in hushed Italian when they thought no one was listening. The bulges under suit jackets that definitely weren't wallets. The basement door that was locked with no fewer than 3 different deadbolts. Marcus and I honeymooned in Italy, staying at Vincent's family home in Sicily. It was there that I first heard the name that would eventually destroy my sense of safety forever, the Torino family. Marcus mentioned them in passing, saying they were business competitors who had been handled recently. When I pressed for details, his jaw tightened and he changed the subject so quickly it gave me whiplash. But that night, as we lay in bed overlooking the Mediterranean, I heard him on the phone speaking rapid Italian. The tone was heated, urgent, and I caught enough words to understand they were discussing someone's permanent removal from the equation. We returned to Chicago and moved into a penthouse apartment that Marcus had acquired while we were away. The building's security was more sophisticated than most government facilities, complete with guards who nodded respectfully at Marcus and looked at me like I was a potential threat. Our neighbors were either mysteriously absent or spoke in whispers when we passed in the hallways. The apartment itself was beautiful but felt like a gilded cage, with windows that didn't open and doors that locked from both sides. For the first few months of marriage, I tried to convince myself that my suspicions were just paranoia. Maybe all wealthy families were secretive about their business dealings. Maybe the strange phone calls and mysterious meetings were just part of running multiple restaurants. Maybe the guns I occasionally glimpsed under jackets were just for protection in a dangerous city. But paranoia has a way of sharpening your senses, and I started noticing details that painted a very different picture of the Castellano family business. The first concrete evidence came when I was doing laundry and found a newspaper clipping in Marcus's jacket pocket. The headline read, "Local business owner found dead in apparent gang execution." The victim's name was Roberto Torino, and according to the article, he had been eliminated in a style consistent with organized crime activities. When I confronted Marcus about it, his face went white, then red, then a shade I'd never seen before. He snatched the clipping away and told me to never, ever go through his things again. The way he said it, with ice in his voice and something dangerous flickering behind his eyes, made me realize I was living with a stranger. That night, I lay awake listening to Marcus breathe beside me and wondered how I had ended up married to someone I was suddenly afraid to be alone with. But fear has a funny way of making you more observant, and over the following weeks, I started paying attention to details I'd previously dismissed. The family's restaurants never seemed to have customers, but money flowed through them like water. Vincent's study was lined with newspaper clippings about unsolved murders, missing persons, and federal investigations into organized crime. Maria spent her afternoons counting stacks of cash that appeared in briefcases brought by men who looked like they'd stepped out of crime movies. The breaking point came during a family dinner at the estate. We were celebrating Tony's birthday, and the alcohol had loosened everyone's tongues. Stories were being told that I was clearly not supposed to hear, tales of problem-solving and message-sending that involved methods I didn't want to imagine. Isabella mentioned something about the Torino situation being permanently resolved, and Vincent raised his glass to family loyalty and the price of betrayal. When I excused myself to use the bathroom, I heard Vincent tell Marcus that the teacher needed to be brought fully into the fold or removed from the equation entirely. I knew then that I had two choices: become complicit in whatever horrors the Castellano family was involved in, or find a way to escape before I became their next victim. The problem with escaping from organized crime families is that they don't typically let people just walk away, especially people who might know too much about their operations. But I couldn't live with the knowledge that the money paying for my comfortable lifestyle was earned through violence and murder. I couldn't sleep next to someone who might have blood on his hands. And I definitely couldn't raise children in a family where taking care of problems meant making people disappear permanently. My escape plan began slowly and carefully. I started transferring small amounts of money from our joint accounts into a secret account I opened under my maiden name. I researched cities where I could disappear, jobs I could take that wouldn't require background checks that might lead the Castellanos to me. I collected evidence of their crimes, photos of Vincent's newspaper collection, recordings of their incriminating conversations, copies of financial documents that showed money laundering on a massive scale. If I was going to run, I wanted insurance that would keep them from following me. The night I planned to leave, everything went wrong in ways I could never have anticipated. I was in Vincent's study, photographing the last of his murder memorabilia, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I barely had time to hide the camera before Marcus walked in, his face a mask of cold fury that told me my secret activities hadn't been as secret as I'd thought. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just staring at me with eyes that belonged to a stranger, before speaking in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "You know, Sarah, my family really liked you at first. They thought you were innocent, sweet, someone who would make me happy without asking uncomfortable questions. But innocence can be dangerous in our line of work, especially when it starts getting curious about things it shouldn't." He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, and I realized that the man I'd married was gone, replaced by someone who looked at me like I was a problem that needed solving. I tried to explain that I just wanted out, that I wouldn't tell anyone what I'd learned, that I just wanted to go back to my quiet life teaching kindergarten. But Marcus shook his head sadly, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I'd fallen in love with. "It's too late for that, sweetheart. You've seen too much, heard too much. The family has a policy about people who know our business but aren't part of our business." He pulled a gun from his jacket, and I realized that my fairy tale marriage was about to end in the most final way possible. What happened next was something I'd practiced in self-defense classes but never imagined I'd need to use. When Marcus stepped closer, apparently savoring the moment before he pulled the trigger, I grabbed the heavy crystal paperweight from Vincent's desk and brought it down on his wrist with all the strength terror could give me. The gun went off, shattering a window, and Marcus stumbled backward cursing in 3 languages. I didn't wait to see if he was seriously injured, I ran. The estate's security system, designed to keep intruders out, also made it nearly impossible for residents to leave quickly. Every door required a key card, every window was alarmed, every exit was monitored by cameras that fed directly to Vincent's security office. But panic gives you a clarity that normal circumstances can't provide, and I remembered Isabella mentioning that the kitchen delivery entrance had a manual override for emergencies. I made it to the kitchen as alarms began blaring throughout the house, announcing that something had gone very wrong in Vincent's private sanctuary. The delivery entrance led to the estate's loading dock, where trucks brought supplies for the mansion's elaborate dinner parties. A catering van was parked there, keys still in the ignition while the driver unloaded cases of wine. I didn't hesitate, I jumped into the van and drove it through the estate's front gates just as security guards came running from the house. In the rearview mirror, I could see Vincent standing on the front steps, his face illuminated by the mansion's floodlights, speaking urgently into a cell phone. I knew he was calling in favors, activating networks, putting a price on my head that would make me the most wanted woman in Chicago. The next few hours were a blur of desperate decision-making and adrenaline-fueled driving. I knew I couldn't go to my apartment, they'd be waiting there. I couldn't go to my parents' house in Wisconsin, that would be the second place they'd look. I couldn't even go to the police, because half the Chicago PD was probably on the Castellano payroll. Instead, I drove south, stopping only for gas and supplies, using cash I'd been saving for months in preparation for this moment. But running from organized crime isn't like running from an abusive boyfriend or a bad job situation. These people have resources that most fugitives can't imagine, networks of informants, connections in law enforcement, the ability to make people disappear without a trace. By the time I reached Indiana, my face was probably being distributed to every criminal contact the Castellanos had from Chicago to Miami. By the time I reached Kentucky, there was likely a bounty on my head that would make even honest people consider turning me in. I made it to a small town in Tennessee before I saw the first sign that they were closing in. A man in an expensive suit was asking questions at the diner where I'd stopped for coffee, showing my wedding photo to the staff and offering cash for information about my whereabouts. I slipped out the back exit and returned to my stolen van, but I could see him talking on his phone as I drove away. The net was tightening, and I was running out of places to hide. That night, in a motel outside Nashville, I made the decision that would either save my life or end it. I called a number I'd found in Vincent's files, a federal agent named Rebecca Chen who specialized in organized crime investigations. The Castellanos had a file on her 3 inches thick, which told me she was someone they considered a serious threat. If anyone could help me survive long enough to testify against them, it would be someone they feared. Agent Chen listened to my story with the kind of professional skepticism that comes from years of dealing with people who claim to have information about organized crime. But when I mentioned specific names, dates, and locations from my months of secret evidence gathering, her tone changed dramatically. She agreed to meet me at a safe location, a federal building in downtown Nashville where even the Castellanos couldn't reach me without triggering a war with the FBI. The meeting with Agent Chen was both hopeful and terrifying. She confirmed what I'd suspected but hoped wasn't true. The Castellano family was one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the Midwest, responsible for dozens of murders, millions of dollars in money laundering, and corruption that reached into every level of Chicago's government. My evidence was exactly what federal investigators had been trying to gather for years, but getting it would mean putting me in a witness protection program that would erase my old life forever. You understand, Agent Chen said, leaning across the conference table with eyes that had seen too much, that if you do this, Sarah Castellano dies today. You'll get a new name, a new history, a new life in a place where the Castellanos can never find you. But you can never contact anyone from your old life again, not your parents, not your friends, not anyone who knew you before. And if the Castellanos ever discover where you are, there won't be anywhere else to run. I thought about my kindergarten students, who would wonder why their teacher disappeared without saying goodbye. I thought about my parents, who would spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened to their daughter. I thought about the quiet, predictable life I'd had before I met Marcus, and how desperately I wanted it back. But then I thought about Roberto Torino and all the other victims whose names filled Vincent's newspaper collection, and I knew what I had to do. The next few months were a strange combination of intense fear and crushing boredom. Safe houses are designed to keep you alive, not to keep you entertained, and while federal agents worked to build a case against the Castellanos using my evidence, I spent my days learning how to be someone else. New name, new background, new mannerisms, new way of speaking that wouldn't remind anyone of the woman who used to teach kindergarten in Chicago. Meanwhile, the Castellanos were apparently tearing apart the city looking for me, offering rewards that increased weekly as their frustration grew. The trial, when it finally came, was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Testifying against people who had once called me family, describing crimes that still gave me nightmares, watching as Marcus sat in the defendant's chair and stared at me with a hatred so pure it was almost physical. He mouthed words at me that I couldn't hear but could understand perfectly, promises of what would happen if they ever found me, descriptions of how they would make me pay for my betrayal. Vincent Castellano was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Maria received 25 years for money laundering and conspiracy. Tony got 30 years for racketeering and murder. Isabella, surprisingly, had turned state's evidence and received a reduced sentence in exchange for providing information about other criminal families. And Marcus, my beloved husband who had once promised to love and protect me forever, was sentenced to death for the murders he'd committed in the name of family loyalty. But even with the family destroyed and its members scattered between various federal prisons, I knew that my danger hadn't ended. Organized crime families have long memories and longer reach, and there would always be cousins, associates, and allies who might decide that avenging the Castellanos was worth the risk. Agent Chen had been honest about the reality of witness protection. It's not a program you graduate from, it's a life sentence of its own. So here I am, 3 years later, living in a small town whose name I can't tell you, working at a job I can't describe, surrounded by people who know me by a name that isn't mine. I watch the sunset from my kitchen window and wonder if my parents think I'm dead. I see children playing in the park and remember the students I left behind without explanation. I go to sleep every night wondering if tomorrow will be the day someone recognizes me, makes a phone call, and sets in motion the final chapter of this story. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice. Maybe I should have accepted Marcus's offer to bring me fully into the fold. Maybe I could have learned to live with the knowledge of what my family did, learned to enjoy the benefits of their bloody business, learned to sleep next to a murderer without feeling like I was suffocating. Maybe the life I have now, built on fear and lies and constant vigilance, isn't better than the life I could have had built on willful ignorance and complicity. But then I think about Roberto Torino and the dozens of other victims whose stories filled Vincent's files, and I know that some prices are too high to pay, even for love. Some families aren't worth joining, no matter how much money they have or how powerful they are. Some fairy tales are actually horror stories in disguise, and sometimes the only way to survive them is to write your own ending. I still love Marcus, which might be the most terrifying part of this whole story. Not the man he became, not the killer who held a gun on me in his father's study, but the charming stranger who bought me coffee and made me believe in happy endings. I mourn for that man, for the life we could have had if his last name had been different, if his family business had actually been restaurants instead of murder. But love isn't enough to overcome everything, despite what the romantic comedies tell us. Sometimes love isn't enough to overcome anything at all. Sometimes the person you love turns out to be someone you never really knew, and the family you marry into turns out to be a collection of monsters wearing human faces. Sometimes the only way to survive love is to run from it as fast and as far as you can. The irony isn't lost on me that in trying to escape from people who made others disappear, I had to make myself disappear instead. The Castellanos took away my identity just as surely as if they'd killed me, except that I had to be complicit in my own erasure. Every morning I wake up as someone else, and every night I go to sleep wondering if tomorrow will be the day my past catches up with my present. They say that witness protection saves lives, and I suppose that's true. I'm alive when I probably shouldn't be. But there's a difference between being alive and living, and some days I'm not sure which category I fall into. I exist in a kind of limbo, neither fully dead nor fully alive, watching the world go by through windows I'm afraid to open too wide. But survival, I've learned, is its own form of victory. Every day that I wake up as someone new is a day that I've beaten the Castellanos, a day that I've proven that love doesn't always conquer all, but sometimes courage can conquer love. Every sunset I watch from my secret kitchen window is a sunset that Roberto Torino will never see, but that I can see because I chose justice over comfort, truth over security, strangers' safety over my own happiness. The story isn't over yet. Somewhere out there, people who remember the Castellanos are still looking for the woman who brought them down. Somewhere out there, Marcus is sitting in a cell planning what he'll do if he ever finds me. Somewhere out there, my parents are wondering what happened to their daughter, and my students are wondering why their teacher never came back. But here I am, despite everything they did to stop me. Here I am, with a new name and a new life and new reasons to wake up every morning. Here I am, proof that sometimes the only way to escape from a family of murderers is to murder your old self first. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very careful and very brave, you get to live to tell the story of how you survived your own fairy tale ending. That's the real twist in this tale of organized crime and family loyalty. Sometimes the princess has to save herself, and sometimes saving yourself means becoming someone else entirely. Sometimes the only way to live happily ever after is to make sure that the ever after happens to someone who never existed before, someone who can walk down streets without looking over her shoulder, someone who can fall in love again without wondering if her new Prince Charming has bodies buried in his family's backyard. The rain is starting again outside my kitchen window, just like it was on my wedding day all those years ago. But this time, instead of feeling like an omen of doom, it feels like a cleansing, washing away the last traces of the woman who was naive enough to believe that love conquers all. Because sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes love destroys everything it touches. And sometimes, the only way to survive that destruction is to build something entirely new from the ashes of who you used to be.